What's up, friend, and welcome back to a new video. Today we are doing something a little bit different because we are going to have a look at the top 10 most important cards from Aetherdrift for Standard. Now, I figured this would be pretty appropriate because Aetherdrift is only about a week away from launching on MTG Arena. So what better time to do this than right now? And of course, as always, let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are on Aetherdrift. Now, with all that being said, let's dive right into it. So before we get started, I will say that this is not necessarily in a ranked order. It's just the 10 cards from Aetherdrift that I think will be the most important for Standard. So let's get started with the Gastal Thrillroller. This is a 3-mana 4/2 artifact vehicle with trample and haste. When this vehicle enters, it becomes an artifact creature until the end of turn with a crew cost of 2. And for 3 mana, you can discard a card and return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it, activate only as a sorcery. Now, I think this card is going to be especially fantastic in Gruul Delirium or like Delirium decks in general. I think Gruul Delirium is by far like a solid tier 2 deck, and it's so close, like a couple of powerful cards away from being tier 1. And I think the Gastal Thrillroller will do a good job helping there. I think it's perfect because not only is it an artifact, which helps you getting closer to Delirium, but it also makes a perfect like discard target or like a mill target, right? Like if I play a Fear of Missing Out or an Inti, I have no problem just throwing the Thrillroller in a graveyard, getting myself an artifact, because I know that eventually I can bring it back out with the activated ability on it. And the activated ability itself is also, once again, really good for Delirium because say I'm in a position where I need a land in my graveyard to get to Delirium, I can just activate the ability, discard a card, so pitch my land, and then get Delirium while also having this creature return to the battlefield as a 4/2 creature with trample and haste. Now, even the trample is like relevant when you think about, you know, things that pump it up, like Monstrous Rages, or what is that card called? The double strike 1-mana thing. If you have Delirium, that can also be really good. Trample is a super important keyword for the Delirium decks. There's also like ways to grow them with the fly trap and stuff. So I think this is going to be absolutely huge for that. Love the synergy with the Fear of Missing Out. I also think this can be relevant for like a mono red aggro. Now, of course, this card as a 3-drop kind of competes with Screaming Nemesis, and I still feel like red aggro decks might still lean to Screaming Nemesis. But then again, like I said, if you're working with Monstrous Rages or like other ways to like pump up your things, Trample is huge. And if you're in a position where, you know, you're swinging with the Thrillroller, it gets blocked, and at some point in the game, you have a bunch of lands in your hand that you kind of can't do anything with, you're a little bit flooded, you can just pitch a land and just put the Thrillroller back in play as a 4/2 with haste. I also like the fact that this is a vehicle. So that means that if your opponent casts like Split Up or something or Sunfall, this creature will stick around because it's a vehicle, so it's not going to get hit by a Sunfall, and you can just play a creature after you get hit by a board wipe and crew it, and the Thrillroller is just capable of attacking again for you. So even that is like a little bit of board wipe resilience can be pretty significant for these like red aggro decks that are probably looking to work with this. But there's also like Delirium and other colors that you can make it work, like say like a Rakdos Delirium deck with Overlord of the Bilmerk or something like that. That is so close to also being something cool, and the Thrillroller is also going to be very playable in that. So overall, I think this is going to be a very powerful creature. I haven't seen many people hype it up yet, so I figured I would start doing that. I think it's a great card. Up next, let's go to our next card here, and we have the Grim Bauble. This is a 1-mana artifact, and when this artifact enters, target creature and opponent control gets -2/-2 until the end of turn. And for 3 mana, you can activate it, 3 mana and tap, activate it to sacrifice this artifact and surveil 2. Now, I don't really think you care about the activated ability much, even though it's a pretty cool upside to have. It's just the fact that this is basically a deadweight that you can pick up. And this is especially relevant when you consider how powerful like the Dimir and Esper self-bounce decks are. Like, I'm not sure. I want to say you play this over Cut Down. Even though this is restricted to sorcery speed, right? Cut Down is instant speed, there's no flash on this thing. But the fact that you can just pick it up and replay it is pretty significant. But we're also thinking about like Ortsoff or Rakdos Sacrifice decks. Ortsoff Sacrifice especially has gotten a lot of love from Aetherdrift. So like anything that could play like a Rottenmouth Viper, for instance, like those types of decks is also something you can think about that the Grim Bauble can absolutely like shine into. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if the self-bounce decks ended up playing like Grim Bauble and picking it up and like having another somewhat version of Nowhere to Run that they can work with. Okay, so the next one is a Voyager Glidecar. So this is a little bit of a like risky one, but I think that I am comfortable having it on this list. It's a 1-mana 2/3 vehicle. And when it enters, you get scry 1. And then you tap 3 other untapped creatures you control until the end of turn. This vehicle becomes an artifact creature and gains flying. Put a 1/1 counter on it with a crew cost of 1. Now, I just think that this creature has so many green flags that I'd be shocked if it ends up seeing no play. Now, I think this is mostly going to be relevant in either like blue-white artifacts, but most importantly, Boros Convoke or Jeskai Convoke, even though I think Convoke is going to go back to Boros, especially now that it also has the new Nesting Bot, which is basically a 1-mana 1/1 artifact that when it dies, you create a Thopter, which is also an artifact. So that actually means that the Convoke decks are capable of firing off 2 Gleeful Demolitions as fast as turn 2, as long as your mana allows it. Because you can just do turn 1 Nesting Bot, Gleeful Demolition on the Nesting Bot, and then Gleeful Demolition on the Thopter, and that could go absolutely insane. And the Voyager Glidecar is obviously a card that can really take advantage of those, you know, the creatures that are just laying around. If you're not in a position to necessarily attack or convoke something, tapping 3 creatures and just making your 1-mana 2/3 a 3/4 with flying, and this can go as fast as like turn 2 as well. And of course, like the crew cost of 1, of which you can just grab a token, crew with it, and just be able to like attack, is just huge, I think. I mean, I think Boros Convoke or Jeskai Convoke is really close to being back on the very top tier of the you know, the meta, and Voyager Glidecar just reads like it would be perfect for it. So that's why it's on this list for me. And of course, in like a blue-white artifact deck where you also have quite some creatures laying around, it can be really cool too. I mean, a 1-mana 2/3 vehicle can also find ways to grow itself, plus fly over, and also scry 1 when it enters. Like, how can it not be good? I'd be shocked, honestly. Up next, and this card actually already has a nickname. We call this the Siege Beetle. So we have the Beetle. This is a 4-mana 6/6 artifact vehicle with trample. And when this vehicle enters, each opponent loses 3 life, and you gain 3 life with a crew cost of 2. Now, this is, like I said already, it's basically Siege Rhino, but if it was a Golgari card and also a 6/6 vehicle at the same time with trample, I think this will just slot beautifully into Golgari mid-range. I mean, you know, and the ETB effect already, lose 3 life and you gain 3 life, is huge. Crew cost of 2 means that every creature in Golgari outside of Llanowar Elf can just like crew it and attack with it. 6/6 trample is like insane though. That is almost like an equivalent to that like vampire that everyone played, the Archfiend. But you know, we have learned that the Archfiend is a little bit more vulnerable because there's a lot of ways to, you know, interact with it and take advantage of it, especially with all the stun effects that are like happening in the mirror. This thing is just huge, and it's such a strong ETP effect. Trample on it too. I mean, I just think it's absolutely fantastic, and I'd be shocked if Golgari isn't playing a few copies of this card at all. Like, I don't know. I think it's truly probably up there as maybe the strongest vehicle of the set. Like, I just, once again, almost like with the Voyager Glidecar, how can something with these stats not see play? And it also slots beautifully into, like I said, Golgari mid-range, which has been, you know, kind of fluctuating between tier 1 and tier 2 for quite some time now. Sometimes it doesn't do much, other times it wins like every standard challenge of the week. And this thing just reads like fantastic for it. So yeah, the Siege Beetle is definitely going to be an annoying card to to play against, as a 6/6 with trample and a crew cost of 2 and a very spicy ETB effect. Alright, up next, we have the Bulwark Ox. This is a 2-mana 2/2 Ox Mount. And whenever this creature attacks while saddled, you put a 1/1 counter on target creature. You sacrifice a creature, and then creature you control with counters on them gain hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn, and a saddle cost of 1. Now, I feel like it's obvious to look at this card and be like, yeah, that's great for like Selesnya counters. But when you realize that the Bulwark Ox is actually a fantastic way to trigger Valiant, all of a sudden I'm getting scared. Like, I think this will slot beautifully into Boros Mice. So we see Gruul Mice kind of being like the dominant deck because they have access to Innkeeper's Talent. And in a way, this Bulwark Ox is a sort of an Innkeeper's Talent and protects your creatures with a super cheap saddle cost. And, you know, you can immediately like start saddling this thing too and start getting those Valiant triggers going on your mice, growing your board and protecting it at the same time. I think especially that we know that the Boros Mice deck is also a really good way to beat the opposing like aggro decks, because in white you have access to things like Sheltered by Ghost, or maybe if you're going to go a little bit extremer than that, You could have like lightning helixes, but what it was missing was just a way to get constant, like more Valiant triggers. Like Innkeeper's Talent always did a lot for like the Gruul decks, but now you have it in like a Bulwark Ox that also protects your stuff. So yeah, I think it's going to be a huge pickup for Burrow's Mice, but I also think just Selesnya counters is getting huge support from Aetherdrift. So it could also be that Selesnya counters is going to be like a solid tier 2 deck, and Bulwark Ox is going to be a huge part of that. As like, I can guarantee you, if there is a Selesnya deck out there that is 1/1 counters, it's going to be playing 4 copies of the Bulwark Ox. Like, it's just that good. Like, it reads exactly how you would want a, you know, engine that gives 1/1 counters to your team to read. You know, it's an engine and it's protection and it's got it all. It's easily like saddled, so it's reads like a perfect creature for that to me. Now up next we have the Speed Demon. It's a 5 mana, a legendary creature demon, 5/5 with flying and trample. Start your engines, which is a new mechanic from Aetherdrift. Basically, start your engines. If you have no speed, it starts at 1. It increases once on each of your turns. When an opponent loses life, max speed is 4. At the beginning of your end step, you draw X cards and you lose X life, where X is your speed. Now, here I am having to bring it up, but you already know any deck that wants to play Unholy Annex, I think, can really take advantage of the Speed Demon. And the Speed Demon in general, with things like Shouldered or something, is just going to be huge. Like, it's just a massive flyer that carries the demon tag. That is kind of what we're looking for. I already mentioned it earlier, but the Arcfiend is kind of becoming unplayable thanks to like the mirror and, you know, all those like stun effects. So we can't really rely on Unholy Annex anymore that much, or on the Arcfiend, and that's kind of why you haven't seen that many Unholy Annex decks like as of lately. But the Speed Demon is just going to be a great replacement, even though it's 1 mana more. What I also like about this card is that it says at the beginning of your end step, draw X cards. So it's basically immediate like value. It immediately replaces itself at the beginning of your end step, because you'll always have speed 1 when the start your engines thing happen, and then you immediately can draw like 1 card and lose 1 life. But like I said, imagine this in combination with like Unholy Annexes, with Shouldereds. Like, it's just a huge 5 mana 5/5 flyer that any deck that wants to play Unholy Annex, you know, can very easily play with. So we can think about mono black. We can think about maybe like a version of Dimir mid-range, Golgari mid-range, like maybe a Rakdos mid-range with all these demons in there. Like, I'd just be shocked if it wouldn't see any play. Like, we know Unholy Annex is a really good card. It fell off a little bit because of you know, the Dimir like takeover, but the Speed Demon just reads incredible, great stats, replaces itself, and can get future value too, right? Like, if you can actually manage to get those like speed triggers to go up, which, hey, a 5 mana 5/5 flying trample demon is probably capable of doing that. You can even draw more cards and more cards and more cards like every turn, which is just insane. And we all know card advantage is king in Standard right now, and this card will do so much for that, not only to help you out with Annex, but also just become a huge card advantage engine on itself. So pretty high hopes for the Speed Demon. And next up, you already know, Spell Pierce. And I am really excited to see this card. Welcome back, Spell Pierce. It's 1 mana instant. Counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2. Well, I've been waiting on this for so long. I was actually hoping that it would come out in Foundations, but they ended up not going for that, which, you know, I can kind of understand. Maybe it's a little bit too toxic to have around for, you know, 5 years or however long Foundations will last. But I am so happy to see Spell Pierce back in meta, especially now that those self-bounce decks are just all over the place. Like, we need to find a way to kick these decks down a notch, and Spell Pierce is going to be doing exactly that. Like, imagine being able to, you know, counter a town ain't big enough for 1 mana, or like a no other run for 1 mana, or anything of the sort. It basically hits nearly their whole deck, and there's also so many decks in the format that have access to putting Spell Pierce in their sideboards. I mean, unfortunately, you know, the self-bound decks can shove this card in the sideboard themselves, but think about many of the other like top 8 Standard decks that are in blue that can use this, like the Mirror Midrange, the Oculus decks, Simic Beans, Blue-White Artifacts. Like, all of these decks can have access to Spell Pierce, and even the presence of Spell Pierce within the meta will also make people think twice about whether or not they should fire off a, you know, a valuable spell like Town Ain't Big Enough, even if you don't have Spell Pierce in your hand, but you have 1 blue open. So the presence of Spell Pierce alone within the meta is going to be pretty significant, I feel. But yeah, I like Spell Pierce the most because it'll just do wonders against self-bounce decks. You know, and as a little bit of a domain hater, I don't mind something like Spell Pierce because it'll help me out. Aha, imagine a world where we can counter the Beanstalk. Aha, it would just be nice. So yeah, I think it's great to have Spell Pierce back. I understand some people are a little bit worried because, you know, it is... Some people do consider counterspells to be toxic. I consider them healthy for the game, and I think Spell Pierce is coming in at the right time, so I love to see it. Especially when you realize, and this is relevant to our next card, thinking about the self-bounce decks, that they actually got a massive pickup once again from Aetherdrift with Momentum Breaker. This is a 2-mana enchantment. Start your engines, and when this enchantment enters, each opponent sacrifices a creature or vehicle of their choice, and each opponent who can't discards a card. Then for 2 mana, you sacrifice this enchantment and you gain life equal to its speed. It just does so much. It's unreal. At its core, it's just a better Tithing Blade. Like, Tithing Blade is a 2-mana artifact that says when it enters, you know, each opponent sacrifices a creature. And you can also, like, transform it or something with artifacts, and it just slowly ticks down your opponent's life total, which is something that's not too relevant. However, Momentum Breaker, though, I feel like is so much better on so many fronts. Like, first of all, it is an enchantment, so you can get all those, like, enchantment triggers off of your Optimistic Scavengers, or, I forget the name of the 3-mana card draw card that, like, whenever an enchantment enters, you draw a card. So they already benefit a lot more with this being an enchantment. It's even relevant for the Rectal Sacrifice decks in the current environment that care more about sacrificing enchantments than they do than sacrificing artifacts, for instance. And of course, each opponent sacrifices a creature of their choice or a vehicle, and if they can't do that, they discard a card. Like, what? In a way, it's like if Hopeless Nightmare and Tithing Blade had a baby, and then Momentum Breaker came out of that. It's insane. And the activated ability too. Not that I think that, you know, the self-bounce decks are necessarily going to work with Start Your Engines, but hey, being able to sacrifice that and gain some life equal to your speed, it could get you out of certain situations. Like, if you have to buy yourself 1 turn against red aggro, this card could make that happen. So yeah, like, huge for self-bounce, huge for, like, Rectal Sacrifice. Like, it's just a better Tithing Blade, and yeah, this is going to be seeing a lot of play, I think. Now up next, we have Voyage Home. This is a 7-mana sorcery, but you do have affinity for artifacts. Now, I love affinity for artifacts and artifact decks in general, so I was so stoked to see this back in Aetherdrift. So affinity for artifacts basically means that the spell costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you control. So you can basically cast a 7-mana spell for just a white and a blue mana, and then you end up drawing 3 cards and gaining 3 life. Like, what the hell? What the hell? Like, welcome back Treasure Cruise, kinda? Like, I don't know. It's just... Obviously, you're locked into very specific colors and a very specific archetype. You need artifacts and you need to be in blue-white. But if you can get there, drawing 3 cards and gaining 3 life for 2 mana is massive. And we have so many of these cards in Standard, especially now with Aetherdrift 2, like, throwing a bunch of stuff on top of that, that they're just basically, like, throwing a bunch of artifacts on the battlefield for no, like, reason at all. Like, Spyglass Sirens... hostile, like an investigate, or what is it, the investigator, I forget the name of the 1-mana 1/2 that puts a map token or a clue token in play. Hostile investigator, I think. Anyways, you know what I'm talking about. There's so many of these 1-drops that give you artifacts in the colors of blue-white. There's a lot of 2-drops that end up doing this. So I'm already thinking immediately this can go into one of my favorite decks at the moment, which is blue-white artifacts. Immediately it can go into maybe like a control deck that can get created. I feel like a couple sets ago there was a blue-white artifact control deck that also ended up playing Simulacrum Synthesizer that was making some moves, and this would basically slot perfectly in that. Like, it's the ultimate, like, Gandalf card draw spell. You just have to make sure that you can get the affinity for artifacts, but you just have to find a way to put 5 artifacts on the board, and I think that's not hard to do at all, and then the payoff is huge. So yeah, immediately slots into blue-white artifacts. I think blue-white artifacts is severely underplayed right now. I think it's a solid tier 2 deck, and it's going to be picking up a lot of sweet toys from Aetherdrift, including Voyage Home. So definitely look forward to that. But yeah, this card is just ridiculous. Like, there's going to be a deck that really, like, takes advantage of it, and it's going to go straight from whatever rogue deck it is to, like, a tier 2, maybe even higher. I don't know. Like, this is just huge. Okay, well, the next one I have to put in there maybe as a form of manifestation, but I have really high hopes for this archetype. So card number 10 is going to be Zahur Glory's Past. Okay, hear me out. This is a 2-mana 3/2 zombie cat warrior, legendary creature, start your engines, and sacrifice another creature to Seville 1, activate only once each turn. With max speed, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, create a tapped 2/2 black zombie creature token. So yeah, maybe this is me manifesting, but I think that the Orzhov Race the Past decks have been really close to being like a significant player in the metagame. But there's just a few like pieces missing to really like push it over the edge from like a rogue deck to like a solid tier 2 deck. And I think Aetherdrift is going to make that happen. I think Zahur Glory's Past is going to be a really big player in that. One of the only free sacrifice outlets in Standard that we have that's playable is Bartholomew. And now we have Zahur. Like, you can only sacrifice once each turn, but that still means you can sacrifice on your turn and your opponent's turn, while at the same time you're also surveilling. And the surveilling is going to be huge, because if I'm playing Aristocrats, I'm most likely doing that in combination with Raise the Past, this is also a 2-mana creature, meaning that Raise the Past can also bring it back to the battlefield for you. There's also a whole thing with the Start Your Engine stuff, where I feel like very specific decks can take advantage of Start Your Engines. It's going to be deck lists that are capable of damaging your opponent without actually having to, you know, use creatures attacking and dealing combat damage to the face to do so. So all of these like passive ping triggers can be huge. Like, think something like Rakdos Lizards, but also think about Aristocrats, where you have Vengeful Blood Witch effects, or Ashlizzlle core effects, where when a creature dies, opponent loses 1 life, you gain 1 life, or like a Vran. There's so many ways to do that. So I feel like Orzhov Aristocrats is really one of the only decks out there that can successfully utilize Start Your Engines. And also because it has a massive payoff card, which is Zahur Glory's Past. I feel like this is one of the best max speed payoff cards that's also playable. Because yes, if I'm playing Aristocrats, I will happily sacrifice a non-token creature to get a 2/2 zombie out of that I can then also sacrifice again to get another, like, you know, death trigger from or anything of the sort. So I feel like Orzhov Sacrifice has true potential to become like from a rogue deck to go to like a solid tier 2 deck. And Zahur Glory's Past is going to be a part of that. Like, it reads perfect. I think that it really is just a great Start Your Engines enabler. Also, Orzhov has really strong Start Your Engine cards with like a Nesting, Bot, and Gas Guzzler being 1-drops. So if you can already start your engines on turn 1 and then hopefully do it again like turn 2, this could actually like be one of the few decks that can curve out into max speed 4. So, you know, maybe it's manifestation, but I really think that Orzhov Aristocrats is going to do it, and this card is just going to be huge for that, and I cannot wait to play with this. But yeah, those are kind of the 10 cards that I consider to be the most important from Aetherdrift for Standard. But of course, I already know, guys, we have to talk about the Verges. Of course, they are like up there. I didn't want to shove them in the top 10 because, like, you know, we all know that these Verges are going to be huge. I'm very happy that we didn't have to wait like multiple sets for all the Verges to be completed. I kind of hate it when the mana is out of balance in Standard, like that there's certain colors that just have better mana for whatever reason out there. Like, I would like to not be at a downside because I want to play like an Izzet deck or something, right? And now my mana is bad. So I'm happy to see the Verges being completed. So obviously like a shout out to those as well. But there's a little bit more that I want to talk about. Now, we've spoken about the 10 most important cards from Aetherdrift for Standard, but I also want to talk about some important mentions, cards that I am personally very excited for, or that I think will also make a strong impact on Standard, but I didn't want to necessarily throw them in the top 10 because they kind of rely on a new deck to be born. So yeah, let's get into that right now. So now let's talk about the 5 cards that I think will also be really important in Standard, but they didn't necessarily belong in the top 10 for, you know, numerous reasons. Some of them being that a new deck has to be created in order for the card to pop off, or like maybe I'm a little bit suspicious about it for certain reasons. But I still think if they end up being huge in Standard, I would absolutely not be surprised by that. So let's get started here with a banger, and that is the Marauding Mako. This is a 1-mana 1/1 Shark Pirate. Whenever you discard 1 or more cards, put that many 1/1 counters on this creature with a cycling cost of 2. Now, this is probably one of the most strongest creatures in the Izzet cycling archetype, but it doesn't even have to be restricted to Izzet. It can also be in other colors that are capable of like discarding They could also be thinking about like Rakdos or something like that. But this seems to be like the ultimate one drop. Whenever you discard one or more cards, put that many 1/1 counters on this creature. Like, if that's what you're trying to do, this is going to be a one drop that gets out of hand incredibly, incredibly quickly. It's also going to be relevant for older formats, but that's not necessarily what this video is about. We're kind of like focused on standard in here. But I actually have pretty high hopes for the Izzet archetype, and I think Marauding Mako is going to be a very annoying creature that you're going to have to like take care of as fast as you can, or else it's going to grow out of control really quickly. There are some beautiful curves possible in like the Izzet discard strategy, right? Like you can work with Fear of Missing Outs, Inties. There's a bunch of other cards that I'm not even like thinking about right now, but that not necessarily coming to me, but there are so many ways to discard cards in standard and then draw some cards as well. And as you're doing all of that, the Marauding Mako is growing. Like, I have high hopes for this little guy, and I hope that Izzet is finally going to come back into the meta with this like new archetype that's kind of being created from Aetherdrift. And this card will be part of it, but the next card is also going to be huge, and that is a Monument to Endurance. This is a 3-mana artifact. Whenever you discard a card, choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn. So you can either draw a card, create a treasure token, or each opponent loses 3 life. Now, once again, this is going to slot into mostly the Izzet deck, but like I said, I could also see it in any other deck that's capable of discarding cards. Like, this could even go in like a, you know, a Dimir deck. Dimir also has a lot of like discard to draw, or like draw to discard effects. So this is a little bit more flexible than a Mako because it's obviously colorless, but I think it's going to be huge, because I also think that there's a lot of ways to beautifully curve out with this thing. Like, you're looking for, if I'm playing Monument to Endurance, I want to get immediate value the turn it comes down. That's kind of like what you're looking for, right? Like being able to immediately draw a card, create a treasure, or make your opponent lose life is going to be huge. And that's possible as long as you play the right cards on turn 2. Think about Inti, right? Inti is one of those cards that, as an attack trigger, you can discard something and then, you know, put a card, like grab a card from exile, put a 1/1 counter on something, give it trample, I don't know, everything that Inti says. But what's important is that Inti is a 2-drop. You can attack on turn 3, you can immediately discard something and get Monument to Endurance value. Something like that also goes with Malcolm, the 2-mana like pirate flyer that also has one of those triggers, like when it deals damage to your opponent, you know, draw a card and discard a card. So there's all of these 2-drops out there, and I just named a few that can curve beautifully into Monument to Endurance, because the second you play it, you can immediately like attack with said creature and get the effect out of it. And of course, this is one of those cards that is only going to generate more and more value. Like, I'm just talking about a curve the second you play it, but what about the potential you have on turn 4? You know, like, you could maybe find ways to get all of the effects out of it. Draw a card, create a treasure, and make your opponent lose 3 life. I feel like it just reads super, super, super powerful. And even though I don't really know, we don't really have a deck that it slots into right now, I'm assuming that there will be a way to just break this card and it will just be incredibly annoying. Like I said, card draws king, this draws cards and ramps you up and makes your opponent lose life. You just have to build your deck in a way that it can afford to play this. But I think the cards that support this archetype can already be incredibly powerful. So I don't think that's necessarily going to be a struggle. So I have high hopes for Monument to Endurance. Now let's have a look at the next card here, which is my beloved, my baby, Bloodghast. It's a reprint. It's a 2-mana 2/1. This creature cannot block, and this creature has haste as long as an opponent has 10 or less life. Landfall, whenever a land you control enters, you may return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield. I was so tempted to shove this in the top 10, but, you know, I have a feeling that maybe my dreams are going to be destroyed by people playing like Ghost Vacuums or something. But there's just so many decks that this little guy can slot into. Think about, you know, obviously Ortsoff Aristocrats, the Raktal Sacrifice. Think about, you know, Golgari Self-Mill. Think about like Insidious Roots things. It's just such a good card. I'm also happy that it's finally playable in like Pioneer or something. But once again, we're just talking about Standard here. And this card, you know, I've played with it in like, what, Timeless even or something. Like, it's such a powerful card that I feel like there's no way it's not going to make a splash in Standard one way or another, even though it is a little bit vulnerable. And outside of like Ortsoff Aristocrats, there's not really like Ortsoff Aristocrats, Raktal Sacrifice. Yeah, I'm not sure if this card is necessarily going to make those archetypes stronger, but you know, I would be very, very sad and disappointed if Bloodghast wasn't playable in Standard. So you know, it's a powerful card. It's perfect for all these archetypes that I mentioned before. You know, the fact that you can put it in with haste. It's the ultimate sacrifice creature. It's the ultimate discard target. It's just so good on so many levels. All you have to do is just play a land and you're good to go. And it comes back out of the graveyard for you. And, you know, trigger your Insidious Roots. Like, the potential is kind of like endless. And yeah, I really hope Bloodghast is going to be making a lot of moves. But it's going to depend on a lot of factors. So that's why I didn't necessarily want to shove it in the top 10. But it would be like top 11 maybe. Top 12, I don't know. It'd be up there. It's up there as one of the creatures that I'm definitely the most excited for and see a lot of potential in. So up next, Loot the Pathfinder. And I just have this card in here because I've seen so many people hype this card up with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. So it's a 5 mana 2/4 creature, legendary creature with double strike, vigilance, and haste. You have 3 exhaust cost, and an exhaust cost you can activate only once each, or you can activate the exhaust ability only once. But if you have a cauldron, you can just give those abilities to a ton of other creatures. So, and of course, the cauldron also allows you to use any color to cast like specific colors, right? Like I could literally play Loot with my Soul Cauldron in like a Rectals deck, for instance. So exhaust green, tap it, add 3 mana of any one color. Exhaust blue, draw 3 cards, yo! And exhaust red, Loot deals 3 damage to any target. So there's not necessarily a deck out there that's really playing a lot with the Soul Cauldron outside of Simic Cookies. But the deck that you're playing needs to be finding a way to shove Loot in the graveyard early on. So yeah, like it has to be either like self-mill or discard or whatever. I mean, there's obviously also cards in the format that can tutor cards into the graveyard for you. Those are in black, I believe. So then you're looking at maybe a Rectals deck or maybe like Dimir, I don't know, whatever you want to do. But I just want to have Loot on this list because of how massive it can be with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Like the Soul Cauldron kind of makes it so that you're not even limited by the exhaust, because like I said, you can just give a counter to another creature and just use all those exhaust effects again, and it does do a whole lot. Like maybe there's even an Ortsov deck that you can create. Like maybe some of you guys remember the Urborg Scavenger deck that I created that also used some of these like tutor effects to shove cards into the graveyard, and you exile it with the Scavenger, and you know, you give a creature double strike, vigilance, haste, which is not even bad. But if you can find a way to incorporate the cauldron in that, so you can also take advantage of Loot, I think that would be really cool. Or, you know, maybe like an Izzet discard to draw deck that also wants to use the cauldron because of the, what is that? I forget the name of the card. It was like this huge blue creature that came out in Foundations. It was a reprint that I've shoved in the cauldron many a times to use for its activated ability. I'm actually gonna look up the card here because I'm gonna go crazy if I can't find it. Where even is it? Where is this guy? Okay, I think I remember. I think it's Arcades. Yeah, Arcades. So maybe in a deck that you would use Arcades, you can also use Loot. I mean, it does have that activated ability to draw 3 cards, which is really cool. So yeah, I do see great potential for Loot with the Cauldron, but yeah, it needs a new deck to be created around it. So that'll be a whole nother story whether or not that'll be a successful deck to play. But Loot and a Cauldron is a match made in heaven. Let's look at the last card here, and that is the Brightglass Gearhulk. I just wanted to mention this card because I think it's the best Gearhulk out of all of them. It's a 4 mana 4/4, limited to Selesnya colors pretty heavily because you need to play double green and double white. And then you have a creature with first strike and trample and a really sweet ETB effect. So when this creature enters, you may search your library for up to 2 artifact, creature, and or enchantment cards of mana value 1 or less, reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle. This is just a lot of tutoring on a single card, and I think it could see play in something like Selesnya Cage, or hey, maybe even like something else. Like maybe it could even further that, like the Selesnya control piles that are out there. But I mostly see it in Selesnya Cage. And you know, imagine being able to fire this dude off on like turn 3 or something. And there are so many cards. It's especially relevant in like older formats, maybe even Commander or something. But yeah, being able to just grab 2 artifacts, creatures, and or enchantments from your deck. There are so many cards you can grab with this. Like imagine grabbing a Ghost Vacuum, imagine grabbing a Shard Mage's Rescue, imagine grabbing the Paw Patch Recruit or the Warden of the Inner Sky or something like that. There's so many relevant 1-drops, so many relevant artifacts or enchantments that you can use. You can even grab removal with this. Like there's the 1 mana Dusk Rose Reliquary that you can grab. So there's a bunch of valuable 1-drops that you can tutor up with this thing that can just allow you to be flexible with whatever situation occurs when you grab the Gearhulk. And yeah, I think it's by far the best one. I hope that it will see play. I think it will. I think it reads really good. So I wanted to have it on there because I'm sure some of you guys were curious to see what my best or like my favorite Gearhulk was, and it's by far this one. I think it's the most playable out of all of them. And yeah, I think Celestia is also in a really good spot right now in Standard, so it makes sense that it would slot into that like pretty nicely. And tutor effects like that can be especially strong because it's also a 4-mana 4/4 with first strike and trample on top of all of that. So that's not even bad stats necessarily for such an effect, you know? So with that being said, I think now the last thing we're going to do in this video is actually talk about the archetypes that I think benefit the most from Aetherdrift. So what I want to say is they're kind of like rogue decks that don't really see, they're not necessarily top 8 most played standard decks. They're a little bit rogue, but Aetherdrift has the potential to make them from rogue to potential like tier 2 or even higher than that. They're going to be seeing a lot more play thanks to Aetherdrift. So let's talk a little bit about that right now. So first up, we're going to talk about probably the archetype that I am the most excited for, and that is that cycling. I guess is that what we're gonna call it? Like, is that discard is also another way, but maybe cycling is like the right word. Well, I don't know. We used to have a cycling deck in the past that was pretty like devastating. So it's not necessarily that. Let's just say is that discard. And we're having a look at Captain Howler here. The Sea Scourge is 4-mana 5 for Shark Pirates. Ward cost pay 2, and then also pay 2 life. Whenever you discard one or more cards, target creature gets +2/+0 until the end of turn. For each card discarded this way, whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player this turn, you get to draw a card. I think Captain Howler is definitely going to be in my version of Is That Discard, because I think this is like the ultimate like payoff. I will happily pay 4 mana for a 5/4 that also is protected with Ward 2 and pay 2 life and can give me card advantage and grow my board. I think Captain Howler is a banger. But yeah, is that cycling in general? I think there are so many powerful cards to support the archetype. Like we already saw the Mako earlier. We saw the Monument to Endurance. We already know that the archetype has cards like Fear of Missing Out, Inti, Malcolm. You have all the pirate synergy that you can also like go into even further. Like we have Pirate Lords in the format already that are also kind of synergistic with this archetype. There's a bunch of other cards that I haven't even shown you guys from Aetherdrift that are pretty playable, especially, you know, they're locked in like the Is That archetype, but they're pretty playable within that deck, and they all look really powerful. So I am sitting here, you know, really hoping that Is That discard is going to be a strong deck. I think I want to say, like, I haven't played with the cards yet. I haven't really seen what the deck itself looks like, but I really hope that there's tier 2 potential in this one. Hey, I'll even take a strong tier 3 or something. Like, I just really would like to see Is That back in the format, especially as a pirate deck that's also working with discarding and drawing a ton of cards and dealing a ton of damage and all of that. So I'm really excited for this archetype. I cannot wait to play it, and, you know, Captain Howlers is going to be awesome too. I think Is It Artifacts is looking very strong in Aetherdrift, and I hope it's going to be a deck that emerges in the meta, thanks to all of this like powerful support stuff. So let's have a look at the next one here, which is Golgari Self-Mill. So I have Ashlizzlle the Emerald Radiant up here. This is a 5/6 mana 3/3 insect druid, and when it enters, you create a 1/1 green insect creature token for each artifact and or creature card in your graveyard. Whenever another insect you control dies, you put a 1/1 counter on Ashlizzlle. Each opponent loses 1 life. I think Golgari Self-Mill is also looking really strong. If you frequent this channel, you know that there was a Golgari Beans Self-Mill deck that I brought out, a video on that not too long ago. And that deck already popped off, and there's so much support from Aetherdrift for this archetype. I believe we have a really strong new removal spell. We have a lot of like new payoff, where Ashlizzlle is one of them. So imagine a world where you just keep milling yourself. And in Golgari, we do have access to things like Squirming Emergence. You could even use a Zombify. Like Ashlizzlle, I'm not necessarily like hyped to pay 6 for this, but if I can bring it out with 3 mana because of Squirming Emergence, or 4 mana because of Zombify, and I have like 10 creatures in my graveyard, you're telling me I'm gonna get 10 insects out of that? And also, you know, when the insect dies, your opponent loses 1 life, you put a counter listing. And knowing that we also have that, is it like a Scarecrow from Duskmourn, which is a 4 mana Golgari card that creates 2 insects upon entering the battlefield, and if you have Delirium, insects you control have Death Touch and +1/+1. bro, like, there's a lot of really powerful cards from Aetherdrift for Golgari mid-range. I think it's one of the stronger looking archetypes to come out of the format with a lot of support. I mean, obviously, all those bean triggers that can also happen outside of that, so we know there's good card advantage in this. We know there's great cards like, you know, self-mill through, you know, the Overlord of the Bulwark, or all of the other cards that you see commonly used in the Golgari self-mill decks. Definitely check out that video on my channel if you're curious to see what Golgari self-mill looks like nowadays. But I think it's only going to get so much stronger, and Ashlizzlle is just going to be a really cool, like, a reanimator or payoff card for that strategy too. So yeah, definitely don't be surprised if Golgari self-mill's out here making moves. The only problem is with these, like, graveyard-reliant decks is that when graveyard hate becomes possible, you're going to get slowed down. Like, it's not as if you're not going to be able to deal with graveyard hate, especially in Golgari, because you're going to have access to great enchantment hate or artifact hate with things like Terra Sunder. You're just going to get slowed down, which is kind of why I think it will face similar struggles to why the Oculus deck never truly became tier 1. I feel like Oculus has always been at tier 2 because, yeah, it gets slowed down a lot by graveyard hate, but you can answer it with, like, you know, the enchantment or artifact removal in white. You're just slowed down a lot, which can sometimes give your opponent enough of a chance to, you know, break through and win the game. But it is possible to play self-mill. You just have to make sure that you have enough, like, ways to get rid of your opponent's hate pieces. And in Golgari, you can do that. In Orzhov, you can do that with aristocrats. And, you know, Oculus, you're also capable of doing that, but you're just getting slowed down a bit. But I'm really hyped for Golgari self-mill, especially with some, like, reanimator elements to it. Like, yo, I will happily reanimate Ashlizzlle. I'll happily reanimate, like, a Valgafoth while I'm at it. You know what I mean? and a Traxa, mill myself, but also get those, like, massive bean triggers on all of these cards that, you know, I'm talking specifically about the cards that get discounted in their cost based on the amount of creatures you have in your graveyard. And there's quite a lot of those in Standard. There's even some from Aetherdrift that are new. I don't remember the name from it, but there is an Aetherdrift card that also gets discounted based on creatures on your graveyard. But you still get to get the bean trigger of that. So I think Golgari self-mill is going to be huge. Now up next, I already said it a little bit earlier, I already teased it, Words of Aristocrats. Massive support from Aetherdrift. A lot of very powerful, like, payoff cards, powerful enablers, you know, Race the Past decks. Maybe I'm biased. I've always enjoyed Race the Past. And I think that it was just a few powerful pieces away from being, like, really significant. Now I get Zahur, which is going to be, like, the ultimate, like, card within that deck. Not only just a surveil, so you can fill up your graveyard, work your way towards Race the Pass, but you can also, you know, get those sacrifice triggers that are really important and get payoff of, like, runs, or get payoff of, like, you know, any other lore, like a sacrifice card that's out there, Ashlizzlle Core, Vengeful Blood Witch, like, you name it, all of those things. Like, Bloodghast is now in the format. We have another really good one-drop. Two really good one-drops, Gas Guzzler and Nesting Bot, that are also just going to slot into that archetype really beautifully. I actually had the honor to check out Orts of Aristocrats about 3 weeks ago when it was recorded for the latest Shuffle Up and Play episode, where I was challenged to beat Brian Kibler at the Tolarian Community College. So if you want to check out me piloting a Raise the Pass deck, Zahur's Glorious Pass with a bunch of new cards from Aetherdrift, Orts of Aristocrats, you can check out that video over on the Tolarian Community College channel. It's the most recent episode of Shuffle Up and Play. And let me just say that the deck absolutely popped off. So very excited for that. Like I said, with the self-mill thing, it can be slowed down by graveyard hate, but there are tools of removing graveyard hate within white. So you can work with that. And, you know, maybe it faces the same life cycle as Oculus, where you're popping off, you're winning everything. People are going hard on graveyard hate. So you kind of have to, you know, put the deck on the shelf, wait till people are, like, you know, dropping their guard. You know, when the time is right, bring the deck back out again and just thrive. And because that's kind of what's happening with Oculus right now, right? Like, people are kind of leaving their graveyard hate behind, and Oculus is, like, shining again. So yeah, very excited for Orts of Aristocrats getting a lot of support. So also another one is Selesnya counters, green-white counters, and we're looking at the District Mascot here, the 1-mana 0/0 dog mount. This creature ends with a 1/1 counter on it. For 2 mana, you can remove 2 1/1 counters from this creature to destroy a target artifact. Whenever this creature attacks while settled, put a 1/1 counter on it, settle cost of 1. Now, a fun thing when it comes back to Shuffle Up and Play, the episode, you know, where I was challenged to beat Kibler. Kibler was actually playing Selesnya counters with the District Mascot in there. So if you want to see Orts of Aristocrat versus Selesnya counters. You can check that out over on the Tolarian Community College channel. But yeah, Selesnya counters, once again, insane amount of support from Aetherdrift. Like we also saw the Bulwark Ox earlier, which is also going to be huge. There's a lot more cards out there that we haven't even spoken about. They're also working with the Selesnya counter synergy. There's a lot of relevant cards within Standard already. I feel like Selesnya counters was so close. It just needed a little bit of like protection, maybe some better one-drops. And that's exactly what we're getting with Aetherdrift. And I think counters is looking pretty strong. Wouldn't be surprised if it's finally like a contender in the top 8 of like the Standard decks out there. Like there's a lot of support. And the saddling and stuff can also be like really relevant. There are like still in Selesnya also cards that benefit from being tapped. Like there's was it Wily Duke or something? Like I don't know if it's going to be a mixture of saddle and counters or if it's just going to be fully focused on counters, but there's already great cards within Selesnya, a lot of like engines to give counters to your things. And now we actually have a lot of beautiful like 1-drops and 2-drops that really curve out incredibly nicely. So high hopes for Selesnya counters as well within Aetherdrift meta. And the last archetype I want to mention here out of the 5 archetypes, I think, that benefit the most from Aetherdrift and have potential to go from a rogue deck to, you know, a tier 2 commonly played deck is goblins. Now, I will say I was really torn between putting goblins on here or dinosaurs. Like dinosaurs for some reason got a lot of support from Aetherdrift too, like an incredible lord, some like more powerful creatures, and of course all those dinosaur cards from Ixalan are also still around and are also still powerful. Dinos was just missing a little bit here and there, but I do still think that goblins has more potential because goblins is actually already played in Standard, not just as a meme deck, but as something like competitive that you can actually get accomplished things with. But it's also like a few cards away from being actually powerful. And I think once again, there's just a massive support from Aetherdrift for this archetype. One of them is the Howl Squad Heavy that we're looking at. It's a 3-mana 2/3 Goblin Mercenary, Starter Engines. There's also a couple other Goblin cards that have Starter Engine synergy. Like, I'm not sure if that's really what you're trying to work with Goblins. But yeah, Starter Engines is going to be relevant in, like I said earlier, decks that can deal combat damage to your opponent without having to actually, like, attack them. But also, if you're playing red aggro and you win your coin flip, you're going to get that Starter Engines trigger, like, every time anyways. So Starter Engines does slot nicely within red-based aggro decks, and especially like goblins too. So this guy, Starter Engines, other goblins have haste, which is awesome, especially when you realize you can slam this on turn 3 and then slam Kranko on turn 4, which is most valuable for its activated ability. So you could immediately tap Kranko with the Howl Squad Heavy and get all of those 1/1 goblins out of that. But even this thing alone, at the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 goblin creature that attacks if able. Like, that reminds me a lot of that. I think it was a Ravnica card, but it was like a 3-mana 2/3 or something with Mentor that also ended up pumping out like goblin tokens. And that was also like pretty playable. We also still have Squee in the format that's also making a 1/1 goblin. And what goblins want to do is goblins wants to go wide, especially with this creature's activated ability where you can add red mana for each goblin you control. So yeah, a lot of ways to pump out a lot of goblins. We also still have that 2-mana raid card from Foundations where if you've attacked a turn you create a goblin token. So a lot of potential to go wide. We still have really powerful goblin lords in the format, other ways to buff up your creatures. And I think goblins is getting a lot of support from Aetherdrift, so I can see it become a more played deck. And instead of just being a rogue choice, being something that people will commonly want to play with. So excited for the goblins as well. And this is kind of all that I have to say about Aetherdrift right now. It's been a long video, but I think the set is definitely not looking as bad as people are making it out to be. I do feel like people kind of get that vibe because I think that the mechanics that Aetherdrift is kind of like built around, like Starter Engines, Exhaust, they're not really looking that good. But there are still a lot of individually powerful creatures within the set and some archetype support that I think will be pretty significant. I don't think Aetherdrift is on the power level of, say, Duskmourn or Bloomburrow or something. So maybe it feels a little bit bad because Duskmourn was so incredibly powerful that now Aetherdrift in comparison to it feels a little bit weaker. But I think the archetypes that are possible with Aetherdrift or within Aetherdrift are really fun. I think the cards are a lot of fun to play around. I'm not necessarily sure if any of the decks or any of the cards that Aetherdrift brings out that will be supporting like a new deck or anything is necessarily ever going to reach tier 1 potential. Like, we're not going to see anything along the lines of like the Overlords or the Enduring creatures. But I think that Aetherdrift will do a decent job in making rogue decks like tier 2 playable, and a lot of like really fun archetypes that it supports. Like I said earlier, there is that cycling, Golgari Self-Mill, Orts of Aristocrat, Green-White Counters, Goblins, and there's a bunch of other stuff out there that just like didn't necessarily make my list, but they're all a lot of fun, and I think the cards are a lot of fun, even though they're not the most powerful out there. I don't think that all the hate that Aetherdrift is getting is necessarily like, you know, justified. I will agree with everybody that the flavor is not for me. Like, I personally don't care too much about the art and like everything's racing and going fast. I also think there's something really funny about Aetherdrift being all about speed, and then starter engines and exhaust are like really slow abilities that take a long time to develop, but whatever, man. Like, we make it work. I still think that, yeah, flavor wise and mechanic wise, Aetherdrift loses me a little bit, but I'm still excited for some of these like individual cards, all the cards that I mentioned on this list, and the archetype support that Aetherdrift provides. So of course, let me know in the comments, what do you think about Aetherdrift? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Is there any cards out here that I missed? Which obviously I'm sure there's people that are like, well, what about this one? So hopefully I don't piss too many people off this video. This is just my opinion. And yeah, a great opportunity for me to like talk about the new cards that are coming out. Early access is actually starting tomorrow. So if you want to see early access, I'll be streaming it on Twitch for many, many hours. We're probably going to go over 10 hours or something. And obviously after that, there'll be some uploads with Aetherdrift on this channel already as we count down the days to the set dropping on the 11th on MTG Arena. But yeah, let me know your thoughts. I'm happy with this list. I'm still excited for Aetherdrift, even though, you know, it's no Duskmourn, but that's okay. Not every set should be a Duskmourn, because power creep all the time isn't healthy for any format. So that's my thoughts. Thank you for sitting through this. If you've made it all the way to the end, I appreciate you so much. And I hope to see you in the next videos where we're exploring Aetherdrift. So thank you.